Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Alfond Inn Happy Hour Tour. This is the last Happy Hour Tour of the season. I'm Dr. Gisela Carbonell, Curator at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum at Rollins College, and thrilled to have you join me tonight to look at a beautiful selection of works from the Alfond Collection of Contemporary Art. So before we begin to look at the artwork, I want to thank our friends and colleagues at the Alfond Inn for preparing that very special theme drink for us for tonight's Happy Hour Tour. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to put them in the comment box. I'll be trying to go through them as I go through our presentation tonight and answering any questions or responding to any comments. It would be great to have a conversation with you about some of these works. Some of them, I think, if you visit the Alfond regularly, or if you have in the past, I would say year, 2 years, and recently, you are probably familiar with them. So to wrap up our happy hour tours of this season, a colleague of mine at the museum, we were having a conversation about what works to select for this happy hour tour. And she said, why don't we look at May Bouquet theme? And I said, you know what, that sounds like a perfect theme, a perfect topic to finish our series of tours. So today I'm gonna talk about 4 or 5 works in the collection, the Alfond Collection of Contemporary Art, that have some kind of floral element. And we're gonna be looking at how these artists use flowers or floral elements in very different ways and working in very different media. So again, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment box, and we're gonna get started. So looking at the collection and going through some of the works and thinking of ways in which we can approach the use of flowers as a point of departure to explore different ways of art making was really wonderful. It just opens the door to approach works of art in a different way, right? So here I'm looking at a visual element or a theme throughout a span of 4 or 5 artists who work in very different media and who are approaching flowers and floral elements for different objectives and purposes, and again, represent them or capture them in very different ways. So our first work that we're going to talk about is this beautiful, colorful work by Ori Gersht, who was born in Tel Aviv in 1967. And this particular work is titled On Reflection, Material E23, after Bruegel the Elder. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. And it's from 2014. It's a pretty large work, as some of the works in the Alfond collection are. It has been displayed at the Alfond Inn, and it's a really engaging piece because I think, and probably you can tell from the image, when we look at it at first, we try to focus our eyes, right? We try to take a second glance and try to figure out if what we're looking at is out of focus, is it my eyesight, right? And that's an interesting element of the piece that I think the artist incorporates intentionally to engage the viewer actively, to look actively at the work. Gersht is a professor of photography. He has been living in England for more than 25 years and teaches photography there. And his work, most of his work and his practice focuses on the process of making images. And in this approach to art making, he's also focusing and looking at and exploring the history of art. And we're going to look at that in a second. So elements having to do with image making, as I said, history and the history of art, memory, nature is a very important aspect, especially of this series, of which this work is part, and experience. But his practice is very much focused on the process that the artist goes through, arranging elements, playing with different types of equipment, and getting all of the different component parts ready for the final photograph. And so in his practice, and especially in this series, the artist is using photography to question the representation of reality. And so here he explores connections between reality and illusion, and also between creation and destruction. So these very seemingly opposing approaches are things that sort of come together or live simultaneously in the image that he creates. So as I mentioned, the title of the work makes reference to a 17th century painter, Bruegel, and that is a source for the artist to look at 17th century still life painters and Dutch painters, and look at how through painting they rearranged nature to create their own scene or their own reality contained within a painting. We're going to look at an example of that in a second, but let's talk a little bit about the process that Ori Gersht works with to get the image to look the way it does. So there are several steps or several parts to this particular process. First of all, the artist recreates a bouquet from one of these, or a floral arrangement from one of these 17th century Dutch paintings. So there's a lot of research, looking at images, choosing one or several images as sources, gathering materials. So unlike the 17th century Dutch painters who represented actual flowers, Gersht often creates arrangements with silk flowers. So talk about this dichotomy between reality and the representation of what looks like reality. Then once he has the arrangement the way he wants it, he places the arrangement in front of a mirror. And then he starts working with the reflection of the bouquet. With the image that is reflected is the image of an actual bouquet, but it's not the bouquet, right? It's the reflection of it. So there's an interesting play and an interesting back and forth here with perception and reality, right? And this questioning of is what we perceive real? Is there a construction there in terms of the image? And that's what we are perceiving. Are we perceiving a reflection and not the actual thing? So it gets kind of conceptual and philosophical when we think about it, and when we try to unpack all these different layers contained in some of these works. Then the artist works with different techniques to shatter the mirror. And in that shattering, of course, there is a fragmentation that occurs and a distortion. So there's that element of distorting, rupturing, and then cameras that capture that shatter element of the mirror. So the surface, as you see it in the final work, and as you see it on the screen, you can identify the cracks, the elements that have been broken, that come apart, that separate, that overlap, that respond to that element of interrupting the reflection and reconfigures it, right? And I was reading, I think it was on the artist website, I was reading how he describes these, or maybe his gallery's website, that they describe the effect that this creates as evoking the craquelure, or the cracking of the oil paint or the varnish in very old paintings. When you see them up close and you see paint that has been there for centuries, it begins to crack. And so is that effect and that play between the historical and the contemporary, working with technology, different types of cameras, intervening the image in a way that brings or cites this historical reference, but that is very much of the moment, and that marks that action of the artist, the intervention of the artist with a vignette or a scene that he has created. So it records a real event, right? The image that represents symbolically the illusion of that event, right? So it's kind of meta, right? It's this multi-layering of concepts and then of actions. And the final image then exists as a document, perhaps, or a, perhaps a document that memorializes or contains that event. And so I wanted to show some of the images that perhaps Gersht is referring to here. And this is a painting by Bruegel the Elder from 1615. It's an oil-on panel, and it's in the collection of the National Gallery. And here we have flowers in a basket and a vase. So this is the, I don't know that this is exactly the one that he was looking at, precisely this one, but perhaps this one is emblematic of a lot of these flower paintings or still life paintings that Gersht talks about being interested in and seeing in museums in Europe and in other places, and then using as sources or citing in his process and his work. And I'm including also some of the details of this painting, because there are so many things that are fascinating about this type of painting and this tradition that Gersht is looking at when depicting flowers or capturing or using flowers to capture them with his camera. And it's that these paintings, in the case of Bruegel, as you can see here, these are very detailed, very meticulous representations of different types of flowers. But interestingly, what we see here is an arrangement of fresh cut flowers brought in and arranged by someone who we don't see in the image, right? So there's an implied subject here and implied labor behind this, which could be the topic of an entirely different talk. But here, there's an interest, a very intentional selection of what flowers to represent. Now, I'm not an expert on flowers by any means, but in reading about this image, it's interesting to point out that the artist intentionally chose flowers that grow in different regions and in different times of the year, in different seasons. And why is this important? I find it fascinating because as I was reading about this particular painting, this is an arrangement that could not have existed in real life because these are flowers from different places and from different seasons that don't at the same time, right? And so what Bruegel is doing in an image like this is creating, is rearranging nature, is taking elements from nature, these flowers, putting them together, perhaps as a symbol of abundance. Some of these paintings may have different spiritual significance, and there's a whole context that we can talk about in 17th century still life paintings. But for our purposes here tonight, I wanted to mention that because it's really interesting that it's not an accurate depiction of what a floral arrangement or a bouquet that would have existed and been possible at that time, and then, or at a specific given time. And then if you look at some of the flowers, you look at some of the details, you can see a butterfly, typically a symbol of rebirth and regrowth. And then you see some other little bugs and insects next to the flowers. So there's a lot of symbolism in some of these images. But what I'm interested in, and the reason why I wanted to highlight these images that Bruegel created in the case of Gersht, is that like Bruegel in the 17th century, Gersht in the 21st century is using his craft, his art, to rearrange these natural elements, to create a scene, to create an image that perhaps would not be possible were it not for the intervention from the artist. And so I find that even though the artist is not depicted, and even though the implements of his work are not included in each of these works, certainly the presence of the artist lives on in the image that could only exist because of this manipulation of elements, this playing around with artistic technique, image making, and natural elements. So we're going to move on to look at a couple of other examples. And here I have them side by side. It's a good comparison to consider, to see the Gersht next to the Bruegel. And again, the Bruegel is in the collection of the National Gallery, and it was just brought in for reference. Okay, so if you have visited the Alfond Inn in the last, I want to say, 2 years, you probably have seen Jennifer Bartlett's Rose in the lobby. When you walk in through the main lobby, through the main door of the inn, you'll see it on the left. It looks a little bit different now because the Alfond Inn just got new furniture and it looks beautiful and a little bit different, but the painting is still there to the left when you walk in. And so Bartlett was born in California in 1941. She lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. And her painting and her work is often closely related to her surroundings and to her own experience, to the places where she lives and works, to the context that she experiences every day. So in this painting, she depicts roses and flowers from her garden in Brooklyn. I don't know if you can tell from the image, but perhaps if you have been to the inn and you have looked at the painting very closely, you may have noticed that the work consists of 2 panels. So this is a diptych, right? It's a large painting that consists of 2 individual panels that go together, that are displayed together. And that the paint is applied in a way that resembles a grid. And that is very much emblematic of Bartlett's style of work, to work with grids, something that goes back to her earlier days of her career in the 60s and 70s when she worked with graph paper, and in more recent works when she is working with tile formats, and here in terms of the diptych format, but also the application of paint. And so here we see 2 views. So each of the panels presents a view of those flowers in her garden that, when put together, at first glance, you may not notice it, but if you look carefully, if you spend a little bit of time with the work, you may notice the different perspectives. And so it looks perhaps a little bit disjointed, which is, of course, completely intentional. And I'll read a quote by the artist, by Jennifer Bartlett, about this work and this type of work, when she says, "I like seeing things kind of off and from different points of view." And so here, that's exactly what she is presenting us with this work. And as I mentioned, it's very personal and reflects Bartlett's own experience. In 2010, the year when she started painting this work, she moved her studio from where she was living at the time, or where she was working at the time in Lower Manhattan, to Brooklyn, where she had a space to have her own garden that she worked on herself and developed. And so it's part of her daily life. It's part of her surroundings and her context. And so the flowers, by extension, become a reflection of herself. right? And I think I have some details here. So the details really show how she works with the paint and the surface of the canvas. And I've had people in tours previously that have asked if this is, if it's printed on something, because of that grid. Sometimes it looks almost not necessarily pixelated, but that kind of grid and fragmentation on the surface of the work. To me, it evokes, and I wonder what it evokes in you or to you when you look at it. But to me, it sort of evokes almost looking outside through a screen door, like a patio door, or through a screen porch or something like that, where you get that grid close to you, and then past it, you can see the bushes and the flowers outside. It's a very beautiful painting, and it's a painting that the more time you spend with it and looking at it, the more you uncover, and the more visually it sort of uncovers itself the more we look at it. There are so many layers in terms of how she works with the material, and then also the depth. And I think on the detail here on the right, you can probably see it a little bit better, this idea of depth, right? The more you look at it, the more you realize that you are looking at different layers, and then that you're going deep into those bushes and into that environment, that then you can imagine for yourself what it must look like and what it must feel like to be there. So it's sort of a very personal reflection on the part of the artist that I appreciate having at the Alfond. Is, again, a beautiful work, and it's kind of, for me, an immersive type of image and experience that at first glance it may look like something very simple, and yet it is very nuanced, and it allows for this kind of contemplation and uncovering of different layers of not only material, but also layers of visual elements, and therefore of meaning. So I would like to know what you think of Jennifer Bartlett's Rose. If you've seen it at the Alfond, maybe you've taken a selfie with it, or you have seen it in the lobby. I would love to hear your thoughts about this work. Moving on to a very different approach to flowers is this work by Maria Magdalena Campos-Pons, who is a Cuban artist. She was born in 1959. And this work, we had it on view recently last fall in the exhibition What Women Want at the museum. And this work is titled A Prayer for Obama, and it's from 2008. It's a series of photographs, so each of these panels is an individual photograph that are to be displayed together. Campos-Pons is a photographer, performance artist, painter, installation artist, multimedia artist. She explores with different kinds of media, and her work examines how history, memory, and religion, among many other things, shape identity. That's one of the main focuses of her work. She grew up in Cuba and is of Nigerian descent, and she's currently a professor at Vanderbilt University. So in many of her works, her heritage informs her decisions for the choices that she makes when making images, particularly her heritage and her experience growing up and learning about her ancestors and learning about religious rituals, particularly the tradition of Santeria, which comes through in this particular work that we're looking at today. So her work is autobiographical in a sense, and with a very present and key component of history, particularly the history of the Caribbean, the history of her own family, and of her heritage, as I mentioned. So here in this work, and I hope you can see the flowers and how she's using that element. Here we have the work as it was displayed at the museum last fall. But so the story behind this work is quite interesting. So in 2008, she was attending an event that was in November of 2008 on election night. She was attending an event with other artists and people from her gallery, and she had planned to do a performance that night as the results were coming in for presidential election in 2008. And someone, and this is the account that I have read about the event, someone gave her a small finger puppet of President Obama, which is what she's holding in her hands in the center. So the performance with the flowers, dressed in white, with elements that evoke these traditions of Afro-Caribbean religious practices, becomes here a ritual for protection and for protection of this candidate, who of course became the president on that evening. And so that's what we see here. And she's holding the flowers in her hands as she is turning almost in this dance-like type of dynamic movement. And then in the center is the moment when she is pausing to hold the puppet that has the face of Obama. And so as I was looking at this image today, reviewing my notes for this talk, I was thinking about the guard petals. This is something that I learned recently. I was looking for videos on YouTube on how to arrange roses and how to arrange different types of flowers so I could do it myself. And I started reading about guard petals, right? The outer petals of the rose that when you buy them, if you buy them at a grocery store or a regular store, you're supposed to take them off the guard petals, right? And then the flower will bloom as it is supposed to. And so this idea of the guard petal, kind of this gesture in the hands of the artist, the way that she's portrayed there, kind of reminded me of this idea of the guard petals sort of holding the flower inside that is about to bloom, and marking for the artist the event of that evening. And so with a work like this one, there's the confluence, the convergence of all the different elements. The artist herself involved in the work and appearing in the work, the image of the man who became president, the first Black president or first Black man to become president that night, the use of white and the flowers, perhaps a reference to those traditions of Afro-Caribbean religions, and then the use of photography and performance, again, capturing these notions, these concepts that have a very long history, a complex history, and then capturing all of that with her camera and using, appearing herself as part of the work of art to document and mark her presence in that moment and the importance of all those elements coming together. So perhaps the flowers here are a symbol for protection, for ritual, for cleansing, ultimately for hope, right? So they are deployed in a very different way than what we saw in Ori Gersht's work, and very different, of course, from the painting by Jennifer Bartlett. There's one more work I want us to talk about tonight because, of course, she uses flowers a lot in her work, and in this painting, which is the one in our collection. This is Firelei Baez, an artist who was born in 1981 in Santiago in the Dominican Republic, and she lives and works in New York now. She came to the U.S. when she was about 8 or 9 years old, lived in Florida for some time, and then moved to New York. And her practice, like all these artists in the Alfond collection of contemporary art, is so fascinating. And that's one of the things that I feel so drawn to these works, because they are beautiful aesthetically. They're so rich in visual elements. You can enjoy them without knowing anything about the artist or anything about the artist's practice. But once you start reading about them or thinking about them a little bit more, it's like opening the door to this whole world of possibilities in terms of research and motivations and interests that help us learn and think about things that we may otherwise not consider in detail or perhaps never heard of before, right? That's one of the things that I love about art, and especially about the collection of contemporary art at the Alfond Inn. So this work, when I look at this work, and this work is huge, is very large scale. This is one of my pictures that I took with my cell phone, so it's not great in terms of the light, but if you look, it's a very large painting, right? So it almost provides an almost immersive experience when you're standing in front of it and you have to walk and move your body to be able to see all the elements on the canvas and sort of take it all in, because there are so many different elements here that speak about different themes that all come together in Baez's works. Her practice is research-based. So we talked about Ori Gersht having a practice that is very process-driven, right? Also research, of course. In the case of Bartlett, we chose an example that is more reflective of her personal experience and her own context and circumstance. Here in Firelei's case, Campos-Pons, actually, sorry, I didn't mean to skip her work, but Campos-Pons looking at history and her own experience together. And here, in a somewhat similar way, Firelei Baez. Baez is an intensely research-based artist. She mines archives and libraries and book collections. She works with imagery that links the historical past with the present and tries to create a bridge to the future and thinking about what's next. She travels, before COVID, she travels to different places, different countries, going to libraries that decommission archives or rare books that she can either take if they are decommissioning them, that she can scan them, that she can photograph them, and use those documents in her work. So it's very research intensive. And in her work, there are references to, of course, history, but also to literature, folklore, identity, and experience. And in a lot of her works, we see some tension between some of these elements that I think invite the viewer to try to read the image a little bit more carefully and to reflect and think about how these elements are working together and what are they talking about, what are they speaking to that is important for her. So flowers are a key element in Firelei Baez's works. If you look at her paintings and works on paper, flowers are different types of flowers, different types of plants are often central elements in her works. In this case, we see flowers that are vibrant and colorful that perhaps at first glance may we may associate with the Caribbean, but they are also, or perhaps more importantly in this particular case, associated with European traditions that kind of overlay with the history of the Caribbean and, of course, the history of colonialism in the Caribbean. So these are some of the central themes that she works with: identity and mythologies, and then power. There's a lot that has to do with power and female agency in these works. And she says there's a video where she talks about her practice and this work in particular, or this series of works. And she says, quote, "I don't want to create images of victimhood. I want to flip it. Beauty can be subversive." And I love that quote because it speaks so much to what she is doing for the viewer here. So what we see here is a large-scale work, large-scale canvas, where she has printed, before she started painting, she has printed and enlarged a architectural plan of a bridge in New Orleans. So this is what the type of materials that she finds in archives and documents and books, that she looks at historical documents and historical archives, right? And some of these images she uses in her paintings in this way. So she has the architectural plan blown up and enlarged. It is then printed on the canvas, and then that becomes the surface, the starting point for her to create her painting. So the use here of an architectural plan of a bridge in New Orleans has importance here because this was a site, of course, affected by Hurricane Katrina and flooding in the area and the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and how that emergency and that crisis was handled, right? And so the more you think about that, the more connections to history you find of why it was handled that way, why that particular area. So there are all these associations, right, that we have with this particular site, this particular place. So that becomes the surface, the starting point for her to create the scene that we see in this image. Over that printed image of the architectural plan, we see two figures that in some points it looks like it's one, or it's connected at one point, right, in the center. So we see these two figures who are confronting each other. It's both appear in very dynamic poses, but there is a tension there between them, right? And so we don't know necessarily what's happening between the two, but what we do see is that we don't see the identity of these figures. They're not portraits of individual people. And actually, it's very hard to make out their heads or their faces. What we see is their bodies, and their bodies are in these tense positions in what looks like a confrontation with each other. The work is titled An Open Horizon or the Stillness of a Wound, and it's a very recent painting. It was created in 2019. Now the flowers and the way that the artist uses the flowers in this painting is very interesting because, as you see here, and these are some cell phone pictures I took, so maybe the lighting is not the best, but you can see here very closely, you can see some of the details, both in terms of the architectural plan that appears in the background, the detail of the use of the flower patterns that cover these kind of silhouetted figures, and then also these elements that you see coming over the bridge and over the figures. It's almost like a splash of water, or perhaps maybe you can see it here, a splash of water or reference to water, right, that relates to this site. And the use of this flower pattern here to create the figures that appear on the painting are inspired by, or perhaps informed by, 17th and 18th century patterns for different types of dress, European types of dress, right? Whether Italian or British, but this type of almost Rococo type of flowers and decorative patterns that have a history there of decoration or dress of women aristocrats, right? Of the aristocracy, of the upper classes, of the European upper classes, right? These intricate flowers embroidered in 17th and 18th century mantua type clothing, right? That have, of course, associations with this dominant white European upper class. So what effect does it have to see these figures who are in tension with each other over the plan, over a reference for a bridge in New Orleans referencing Hurricane Katrina, with this water that's coming over them? There are so many layers, right, in terms of the significance, the symbolism of these flowers, the symbolism of the figures, the symbolism of the background, all rooted in historical events and all having implications in this historical research that the artist has done to bring them together to create this image. So at first glance, an image that may, and sometimes we can say, well, it looks like they're dancing or maybe they're fighting. There are some references in this image also to YouTube videos and recordings of females engaging in physical fights. So there are so many layers with popular culture, recent events, history, and the artist's personal experience and identity, and kind of bringing all that together. These are paintings that pack so much, right? That contain so many layers of meaning that we can read them in a way that we can place them in that context, but again, that we can admire and enjoy the talent of the artist for bringing all that together, and yet give us these amazing renderings, in this case, of these different types of flowers in such a bright and beautiful way. I like what she said, and I read this quote. I like what she said about beauty can be subversive, right? This idea that things that are beautiful don't necessarily mean that they are completely devoid of significance or of meaning, or that they can lead us to think about very serious topics, and that they contain meaningful assertions about history and about ourselves, right? So this is an amazing painting. It's on view at the Alfond Inn at the moment. So if you go visit, you can see the Rose Diptych by Jennifer Bartlett. You can see Firelei Baez's work. And if you're interested in seeing more, you can visit our website at rollins.edu/cfam to see a lot more and to see many other works from the Alfond collection of contemporary art that you can enjoy. You can read about the artists, you can read about the works. Every week we're adding more information to the website, so it keep going back because there may be more information for you. And also I included here a picture of the 3 volumes that we have published so far, the Art for Rollins, volumes 1, 2, and 3, which are books dedicated specifically to the Alfond collection of contemporary art. So every work in this collection is included in these 3 volumes. The new ones, of course, are not, so those will be in volume 4. But if you're interested, you can get Art for Rollins at the museum store. So we have time for a couple of questions or comments. If you have any questions or comments, I'm curious to hear which of these works interests you the most, which of these works grab your attention, if you have seen them before in person, if there's anything that you wanted to comment or to ask. We have a couple more minutes. Okay, looks like we don't have any comments or questions at the moment. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us and thank you for watching. If you're watching this later, we hope to resume our in-person happy hour tours soon, but for now, we are taking a summer break with the happy hour tours, but we will be offering a lot of other programs throughout the summer with our new exhibition season at the museum. So make sure to check our website and check our social media pages for the latest. Thank you so much and have a great evening. Bye-bye.